When we hear the words child marriage, most of us picture remote, far-off places, isolated villages in countries struggling with poverty or conflict. It's easy to assume that child marriage is a problem that exists somewhere else, far from the safety and progress of Western nations. But the reality is much closer to home. Child marriage, a practice where individuals under the age of 18 are legally permitted to marry, also happens in the world's wealthiest and most progressive countries. While most people think it's outlawed or only a historical relic, the truth is it's still legal in many places, sometimes happening quietly with little attention from the media or society at large. Now, this is not an easy topic to discuss, but that's what makes it so important. Child marriage impacts thousands of children every year in the West, most of whom are girls, and many of whom find themselves trapped in marriages they didn't want, but can't legally escape. Now, before we dive into where and how child marriage happens in the West, let's take a step back and clarify just what we're talking about. Child marriage, as defined by international human rights organizations, typically refers to any formal or informal marriage where at least one of the parties is under the age of 18. Now, that might sound pretty simple. No marriage under 18. Easy. But here's where things get complicated. In many countries, including the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe, minors are allowed to marry under certain conditions. We're talking about legal loopholes, things like parental consent, judicial approval, or even pregnancy exceptions that create pathways for minors to get married even when they're not legally considered adults. For example, in the US, most states set 18 as the minimum age for marriage, but almost every state has exceptions that allow younger children to marry. Parental consent is one of the most significant loopholes. And sure, that might sound reasonable at first. I mean, what's wrong with parents giving permission? But in practice, it's often a different story. These exceptions are sometimes used when the child is being coerced or pressured by family or cultural expectations. And it's not just the United States. In Canada, minors as young as 16 can get married with parental consent in several provinces. And in the UK, until very recently, children could marry at 16 with parental consent too. So while we often think of the West as having strong child protection laws, when it comes to marriage, these loopholes still exist. They allow child marriage to happen in ways that are legal, but are often far from just or fair for the young people involved. So how widespread is this issue? Well, let's start with the US, shall we? Between 2000 and 2018, roughly 300,000 minors were legally married in the United States. And you heard that right, that's 300,000 children. Most were girls, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, marrying partners often much older. In many states, laws allow minors to marry if they have parental consent or a judge's approval. And some states go even further, allowing exceptions for reasons like pregnancy. These exceptions mean that in some places, a child as young as 14 or even younger could end up in a legally binding marriage. 3 states, California, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, do not specify any minimum age, and in Mississippi, a judge can waive minimum age requirements. Take Kentucky, for example. Until 2018, the state had one of the highest rates of child marriage in the country. The law allowed minors as young as 16 to marry with parental consent. But if a girl was pregnant, she could marry even younger with a judge's approval. Kentucky eventually passed a law in 2018 raising the minimum age to 17, but it was a long time coming. During the years before the reform, countless minors were married in a legal framework that allowed parents and judges to decide for them, often with life-changing consequences. And then there's the case of Florida, where a woman named Sherry Johnson became an outspoken advocate for changing child marriage laws. Sherry's story is heartbreaking. She was only 11 years old when she was forced to marry an adult after becoming pregnant. Like many girls in similar situations, Sherry's life was shaped by a decision that was not hers. For years, she fought to get out of that marriage and later to change the laws that allowed it to happen. Thanks to her efforts and the support of many others, Florida passed a law in 2018 raising the marriage age to 17. However, exceptions still exist, allowing 17-year-olds to marry under certain conditions. So while progress has been made, there's still more to be done. And let's not forget New York. Until 2021, minors as young as 14 could marry with judicial approval. 14, an age when most teenagers are just starting high school, yet they could be legally bound in marriage. After significant pressure from advocacy groups and activists, New York finally raised the minimum age to 18 with no exceptions. So, why does this happen? Well, it often comes down to a combination of tradition, cultural norms and legal loopholes that haven't been fully addressed. In some communities, there's pressure for young girls to marry early, especially if they become pregnant. In others, it's seen as a way to preserve family honor or maintain social expectations. Canada, often regarded as a bastion of human rights and progressive values, might seem like an unusual place for child marriage. But the truth is, child marriage is still possible there too, thanks to certain legal exceptions. In Canada, minors as young as 16 can marry with parental consent in several provinces. This means that while the legal age to marry is set at 18 in most places, exceptions exist. So a 16-year-old can legally marry as long as their parents approve. It's a loophole that many people aren't even aware of, but it opens the door for young people to enter into marriages that they might not fully understand or want. According to 2019 research findings of an assistant professor at McGill University, between 2000 and 2018, the Canadian government granted marriage certificates to approximately 3,687 children. Many minors in these situations lack the resources or autonomy to say no, and once they're married, they often find it extremely difficult to leave. While Canada has made strides in protecting minors, these legal exceptions still exist, creating opportunities for child marriage to continue in pockets of the country. It's an issue that does not get much attention, but it's one that continues to affect vulnerable young people. Until 2022, it was legal for 16 and 17-year-olds to marry with parental consent in the United Kingdom. This law allowed child marriage to happen under the radar, often involving minors from traditional or conservative communities. Many of these young people found themselves married off with little say in the matter, often under family pressure. After years of advocacy, the UK government finally passed a law in 2022, raising the legal marriage age to 18 with zero exceptions. It was a significant victory for activists who had been pushing for this change for years. The stories of girls being married off at 16, often sent abroad or forced into marriages they didn't want, had reached a breaking point. The legal reform was a step in the right direction, but it came after years of struggle. In the decade up to 2016, some 3,300 marriages in England and Wales involved children, the majority of which were girls. In other European countries where child marriage, while technically illegal under national law, has been a challenge within certain communities. In some cases, child marriages take place unofficially, driven by cultural traditions or religious beliefs. While these marriages aren't always recognized legally, they can still significantly impact the young people involved. In Germany, for example, the government has had to grapple with how to address child marriages that occurred before families arrived in the country, particularly among refugee populations. These marriages, while not legal under German law, create difficult situations where young people, especially girls, are already in marriages and have few legal rights or protections. The authorities have been working to address these cases sensitively, balancing a respect for cultural differences with the need to protect minors. It's easy to think of child marriage as a legal issue or a technicality, but behind every statistic there's a person, usually a young girl, whose life is being dramatically altered. One of the most immediate impacts of child marriage is education loss. Many minors who get married are pulled out of school, whether because of family pressure or because their new responsibilities make it difficult to continue attending classes. When a child is forced to drop out of school, they lose more than just their education. They lose the opportunity for economic independence, the ability to build a career, and a chance at a future free from poverty. Research shows that girls who marry early are far less likely to finish their education, which leaves them economically vulnerable for the rest of their lives. Then there are the health risks. Marrying young often leads to early pregnancies, and pregnancy during adolescence causes serious health risks for both the mother and the baby. Adolescent mothers are more likely to suffer complications during childbirth, and their babies are more likely to experience poor health outcomes. In countries where child marriage is more prevalent, maternal mortality rates are significantly higher among girls who give birth before their bodies are fully developed. But the consequences don't stop at education and health. Emotional and psychological impacts can last a lifetime. Many of these marriages involve significant power imbalances, with the minor often being in a weaker position than their much older spouse. This can lead to feelings of isolation, anxiety, and depression, as well as emotional and, in some cases, physical harm. The pressure to conform to the role of a spouse at such a young age can lead to long-lasting psychological scars. And then there's social isolation. Many girls who marry young find themselves cut off from their peers, friends, even their family. They may be expected to move in with their spouse's family, where they have little support and even less freedom. Without a strong social network, they often feel trapped and powerless, with few resources to help them escape a marriage that they didn't choose. The emotional toll of child marriage is devastating. These children are thrust into adult roles before they're ready, often without understanding the full scope of what's happening to them. The damage, psychologically, emotionally, socially, can last a lifetime. While some young people eventually find a way out of these marriages, the scars remain. Many survivors describe a sense of lost childhood, of missed opportunities, and of emotional trauma that lingers long after the marriage ends. So, the crux of it all comes down to why child marriage still happens in modern, developed countries. You'd think that in places with robust legal systems and protections for minors, child marriage would be a thing of the past. But the reality's way more complex. One of the primary reasons child marriage persists is cultural and traditional norms. In some communities, particularly conservative or religious ones, there is a pressure for young girls to marry early. Marriage is seen as a way to secure a family's honor, protect girls from perceived societal dangers, or ensure their economic stability. These cultural pressures can be overwhelming, especially for minors who lack the autonomy to resist their family's expectations. In many cases, the parents believe they are doing what's best for their child, but the result is often far more damaging. And that is where this discussion gets real tricky. On the one hand, liberalized nations are striving to protect minors in every way they can, but sometimes this comes up against cultural and religious traditions, which nations are typically doing everything they can to respect. The two dogmas sometimes come into conflict, and many countries haven't quite developed a way of addressing it. Nations don't want to be labeled as xenophobic or racist, so often they'll apply loose blanket laws that cover the issue but leave plenty of holes. Governments typically shy away from tackling the problem at the root cause because this would bring them into conflict with certain groups. So who are these groups? And deeper we go into this minefield of a discussion. In Western nations, it's commonly assumed that child marriages are much more common within non-native communities than in native ones. And this is true to a degree, but it only tells a part of the story. Two groups that are often singled out by the media on this topic are the Romani people and conservative Islamic communities that retain close ties with their home countries. So let's start with those two. While details are incredibly vague, a UNICEF report from 2017 estimated that more than half of Romani girls marry before the age of 18 across Europe. This is a group that still suffers discrimination and isolation, as well as high rates of poverty. Child marriage has long been part and parcel of the community, while it's not uncommon for youngsters to be married off in poverty-stricken areas as a way of reducing the number of mouths to feed. It's a shocking way to think about it in today's world, but there you go. Discussions around this are notoriously difficult, in part because of the continued isolation of the Romani community. It remains a long-standing tradition within the Romani, and Western European countries are struggling to make much headway here. Major steps have been taken in recent years, but conservative Islamic communities also have higher rates of child marriages, sometimes where an older man travels back to another country before returning with a child bride, with Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Somalia being the countries most often involved. If addressing the Romani issue has been dicey, trying to affect actions within Islamic communities proves an even greater challenge. People sometimes see it as a religious matter, but that's not exactly the case. There's nothing in the Quran that explicitly supports child marriage, but there are certain passages that speak of an age of maturity that is typically linked with the menstrual cycle. Instead, this is a social and cultural issue within communities very different from what we've come to expect in the West. So far, the argument of the outsiders causing all these problems rings true, right? Well, now it's time to go the other way. Much of the opposition to blanket bans on child marriage in the United States comes not from minority communities that are seeking to instill their traditions in the good old US of A, but from evangelical groups and their lobbyists with a healthy amount of support, albeit quieter, coming from Orthodox communities, with the Jewish community certainly not being squeaky clean here. While in Canada, many of the child marriages occurred among small religious groups in British Columbia and Quebec. And that brings us back to religion. Is it simply a coincidence that fringe conservative religious communities, whether that's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, have high rates of child marriage? Well, no, of course not. It doesn't matter how forward-thinking many parts of these groups might be, there will always be sections that base their beliefs and actions in the modern day on ideas that were written down thousands of years ago. As society moves further and further forward, this will always clash with long-standing ideas ingrained in some religious beliefs. The leaders of every major religion in Western countries have voiced their concerns and opposition to child marriage, but fringe groups continue to do as they wish. So, is this a left versus right issue? Well, again, not exactly. Recently in California, the supposed bastion of liberalism, local chapters of the American Civil Liberties Union and Planned Parenthood came out against a law that would have banned child marriage in the state. The prospective law was eventually squashed because lobbyists from these groups were able to pressure Democratic lawmakers into withdrawing it. Now, despite Californian absurdity, it's fair to say that child marriage is much rarer in Democratic states than Republican. As of June 2024, 13 states have banned underage marriages, with no exception, and most have a solid Democratic leaning. Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Rhode Island, New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, Michigan, Washington, Virginia, and New Hampshire. In some states, you could probably guess which, when the question comes down to abortion or underage marriage, enough will choose the latter to ensure that the state's laws remain in murky limbo. This isn't simply a problem that can be blamed on outsiders. In the United States in particular, it's an issue that strikes deep at religious doctrine and ideas of self-governance. It affects practically every ethnicity, but for different reasons, whether religious, cultural, societal, or even socioeconomic. Across the West, the fight to end child marriage continues, with survivors and activists leading the charge. They're pushing for stronger laws, more awareness, and better protections for minors. It's not just about changing the legal age, it's about changing the mindset that sees children as ready for marriage. This is an issue we think we all agree on, but obviously that's not quite the case. This is just about as complex and as murky as they come. Thanks for watching.